What if this moment was never truly yours? Two paths, two choices, two outcomes that feel different, but lead exactly where they were always meant to. The hand moves, the eyes decide, the face follows. And maybe the question isn't what you will choose, but whether it was ever a choice at all. What if your choices were already decided? What if every decision you make was already determined? Not just the major ones, not just the mistakes you regret or the moments that changed your life. Every decision, every pause, every attraction, every fear, every word you almost said, and every word you actually did. What if the feeling of choosing is only the final surface of a deeper process that was already moving long before you became aware of it? That possibility is disturbing because freedom is not a small part of how humans understand themselves. It is the center of dignity, guilt, love, morality, ambition, and regret. We build identity around the belief that we could have done otherwise. But if that belief is only a convincing inner experience, then the self begins to look less like an author and more like a witness, arriving late to decisions already made in silence. Science suggests something unsettling. In certain experiments, measurable brain activity appears before a person becomes consciously aware of deciding. Neurons fire, signals build, patterns emerge, and only afterward does conscious awareness seem to catch up and say, "I chose." That does not automatically solve the mystery of free will, but it does destabilize the story we tell ourselves. Because if the brain begins the decision before the self narrates it, then what exactly is consciousness doing? Leading? Following? Interpreting? The old image of a sovereign inner self issuing commands begins to weaken. Instead, the mind starts to look like a layered process, where awareness may be less a ruler and more a late-arriving commentator trying to turn hidden machinery into a coherent story about agency. If that is true, are we truly free? Heaven asks the question softly, but it lands with force. Because if awareness is not the origin of action, then freedom becomes much harder to define. Perhaps we are still free in some deeper sense. Or perhaps freedom was always more fragile than we imagined. Human beings do not experience themselves as puppets. We experience hesitation, conflict, responsibility, desire, effort, resistance. We feel the burden of choice from the inside. That is why the scientific challenge matters so much. It does not only threaten a theory, it threatens an intuition so basic that without it, ordinary life begins to feel strange. If the conscious self is not fully in command, then the most intimate part of human existence may be partly hidden from the very being living it. Every choice feels real. That is what makes the problem so difficult. When a person chooses a road, speaks a truth, hides a lie, walks away, forgives, betrays, resists temptation, or gives into it, the inner experience is not abstract. It feels immediate, lived, personal. We do not merely watch choices happen. We inhabit them. We struggle, weigh, hesitate, imagine outcomes, and then act. The reality of that experience is what makes free will so hard to surrender. A person standing at a crossroads does not feel like a machine executing hidden code. They feel the gravity of possibility. They feel that more than one future is open, and that their action matters in deciding which one becomes real. So if that feeling is false, then illusion is doing far more work in human life than most people are comfortable admitting. But what if that feeling is an illusion? Hell enters exactly at the moment certainty begins to crack. She does not deny the experience of choosing. She questions its interpretation. The mind may feel free for the same reason dreams feel real while we are inside them. Convincing inner experience is not proof of ultimate truth. Perhaps what we call will is only the conscious shadow cast by deeper causes: biology, memory, conditioning, trauma, desire, chemistry, and invisible patterns formed long before the moment we name as choice. If that is true, freedom may be less like authorship and more like a story the brain tells to preserve coherence. A beautiful story, perhaps. Necessary even. But still a story. And if the sense of agency is only narrative after the fact, then the self we defend so fiercely may be less independent than it feels. For centuries, philosophers debated this mystery because the problem reaches far beyond science. Determinists argued that every event follows from prior causes. Libertarians insisted that genuine freedom must break causal chains in some meaningful way. Compatibilists tried to save responsibility by redefining freedom not as absolute independence, but as acting in accordance with one's motives without external coercion. The debate never ended because each position protects something humans do not want to lose. Determinism protects order. Libertarian freedom protects dignity. Compatibilism protects moral life from collapse. A book on a table becomes the perfect image here because philosophy has spent generations trying to name what ordinary experience refuses to surrender and what logic keeps trying to dismantle. The mystery survives precisely because neither thought nor intuition can fully defeat the other. If free will is an illusion, who is responsible for our actions? That question is where abstraction suddenly becomes dangerous. Because the moment agency weakens, blame, guilt, praise, punishment, and forgiveness all begin to shift. A person looking into a mirror is not only seeing a face, they are seeing the possibility that the self they hold accountable may be far less self-originating than moral language assumes. If every action is the product of genes, conditioning, environment, unconscious drives, and causal chains stretching backward beyond awareness, then what exactly are we punishing when we punish? What are we praising when we praise? Responsibility becomes difficult, not because actions stop mattering, but because the individual actor becomes harder to isolate from the forces that formed them. The mirror turns moral certainty into a much stranger reflection. Could morality exist without freedom? A courtroom is the perfect symbol because law depends on the belief that people could have acted differently, at least in some meaningful sense. Moral language depends on alternatives. Justice assumes choice. Regret assumes choice. Repentance assumes choice. Even love becomes difficult to understand without some form of freedom, because devotion that could never do otherwise begins to look less like love and more like programming. And yet society cannot function without treating people as agents, even if philosophy keeps making agency unstable. That tension matters. Perhaps morality requires freedom, or perhaps morality is simply the language humans use to regulate behavior inside a deterministic world. If the second possibility is true, then the courtroom is not the site of justice in any ultimate sense. It is only one more system for managing causes. Or are we simply following a script we never wrote? That image is powerful because it captures the deepest fear hidden inside determinism. Not merely that choices have causes, but that the self is more acted through than acting. A person standing between heaven and hell becomes the perfect metaphor. We feel like we are deciding. But what if temperament, upbringing, memory, biology, culture, trauma, desire, and timing have already tilted the scale before the conscious mind arrives? We call the result my decision because there is no other language available. But perhaps authorship has always been partly retrospective. Perhaps the script was written by forces so intimate that we confuse them with ourselves. And yet even now, hearing this, something inside the viewer resists. That resistance may be irrational, or it may be the last remaining evidence that freedom is real. What if freedom is not absolute? That possibility changes everything because it refuses both extremes. Maybe we are not fully self-created authors, but neither are we empty puppets. Perhaps freedom exists inside limits, shaped by biology, history, desire, trauma, and unconscious processes, yet not erased by them. Light and darkness mixing in the frame becomes the right image here because human agency may be partial, constrained, developing, and incomplete, rather than total or non-existent. We do not choose the conditions into which we are born. We do not choose our first language, our first wounds, our first fears, or the structure of our nervous system. But perhaps within those limits, something real still opens. Not infinite control, not godlike independence, but a narrower and more difficult freedom that has to be discovered, practiced, and strengthened rather than simply assumed, but something we discover. Heaven answers not with certainty, but with invitation. Freedom may be less like a possession we naturally have, and more like a capacity we slowly cultivate. A person can become more conscious of impulse, more honest about desire, more able to interrupt habit, more capable of resisting what once ruled them automatically. In that sense, freedom would not mean existing outside causality. It would mean awakening within it, becoming lucid inside patterns that once moved us blindly. The soul, if we use that word, may not be the part of us untouched by forces. It may be the part that learns to see them, judge them, and sometimes redirect them. That kind of freedom is humbler than the old heroic image, but perhaps more real. Not absolute control over life, but a growing ability not to be entirely owned by what formed us. Choice may not control the universe, but it might define who we become. That is the final shift, and perhaps the only version of freedom strong enough to survive doubt. Maybe we do not choose every condition, every impulse, every hidden cause shaping the moment. Maybe the universe is far less open than we imagined, but even then, something remains at stake. Not total authorship, but orientation. Not control over everything, but participation in what we become through response. Under a star-filled sky, the question stops being whether we are metaphysically free in some perfect sense. It becomes whether our acts still carry the power to shape character, meaning, conscience, and destiny. Perhaps freedom is not the ability to stand outside the universe and command it. Perhaps it is the mysterious, fragile, limited ability to answer life in a way that slowly becomes a soul. See you in the next video, where the questions only get darker.